Studio Ghibli's My Neighbor Totoro is simply a treat to watch. This film was the fourth to be directed by Hayao Miyazaki, and it's easily one of his very best. And that's saying a lot, considering his undeniably impressive body of work. I believe that, out of all of his films, My Neighbor Totoro is perhaps the best film he ever made for younger viewers, which, again, is saying a lot, since most of his films are aimed towards a younger audience. But what I think makes this film more appealing to kids is the fact that it is a perfect blend of simplicity, entertainment, and imagination. The film's simplicity in its story is one of the main reasons that I'm drawn to it. All the plot is, at least on the surface, is the story of two young girls' lives after they move into a new home and encounter magical beings, most notably a big rabbit-like creature that the girls name Totoro. And that's pretty much it. Of course things happen, but most of the events that occur are parts of several smaller plots to make up the film. The film isn't episodic, plot-wise, but it doesn't have a main plot either. I think this type of story structure works well for the film, because it allows for it to best depict real, everyday human life. And it's so refreshing to see something like that in an animated film. Because most movies for kids have the same type of, epic story to it, where the characters have to go on big adventures and do things that are really larger than life. And I have nothing against that type of story. Heck, some of my favorite animated films are like that. But it's so refreshing to see something different. And I also think that it makes the characters in the film even easier to sympathize with because of the heightened realism in its story structure. Of course, many of the events that occur in the film aren't realistic, but Miyazaki and others who worked on this film successfully managed to include unworldly creatures in a story about two girls' lives following an unspecified amount of time. And yeah, just to elaborate, this film is basically about two young girls who mainly spend their time playing together, and their play occasionally involves mythical creatures. And it's the scenes with these creatures that gives this film the majority of the popularity that it has. But to me, some of the best parts of the movie are the scenes without Totoro and the other creatures. The two sisters and their parents feel like a real family, and they are all instantly and insanely likable, especially the two younger girls, who, as I said earlier, spend a majority of the film at play. And I really can't think of another film that depicts life of characters at a time of innocence like this film does. And if there is one, I highly doubt it's quite as good as this one. And the greatness of innocence is really what this film is about. And it is the innocence of the two main characters and the sheer goodness that is in this film that really touches me. And later in the film, when things become more serious, it's that innocence that these characters have that make things even more effective later on. And now I suppose that I should talk about Totoro and the other creatures in this film. You can tell by looking at your screen that the designs for these creatures are brilliant. With the one exception of the soot sprites, which I saw in Spirited Away, every creature in this film looked original. And yet, also everything in this film had a form of simplicity to it. Look at Totoro. I personally find his design to be one of the greatest produced by Miyazaki or anybody else at Studio Ghibli. And yet it's such a simple design. I mean, it's far from one of Miyazaki's most creative works, and yet for some reason it stuck with me since I first saw it. And I think this is a reflection of the greatness of Studio Ghibli's designs. They can have such a variation to them creatively, and yet they can also create a simple-looking creature that may have a simple design, but it also sticks with you for a long time. And I know it hasn't left my mind since I first saw this film. I know that I've been very technical so far, and I probably sound like I've spent more time analyzing the film than watching it, but I assure you that this isn't the case. I wanted to get the analytical stuff out of the way first, in order to show why I feel this film succeeds on a technical level. But I'm now going to speak as a fan of movies. I first saw My Neighbor Totoro a few weeks back, and I was hooked immediately. Obviously, I like the designs of Totoro, and, the other fictional creatures, but I can't express enough the joy I felt while watching this film. I was truly touched by this picture, I really was. It warmed my heart, and I felt like a kid again while watching. I love how Studio Ghibli can create such realistic characters in just about every single film of theirs I've seen. Satsuki and Mei are no different. They seem like real little girls. Mei, the youngest, is one big ball of energy. She's curious about everything, she's playful, but she managed not to annoy me, which is a hard thing to do when that type of character is in a movie. And Satsuki, the older child, she's also insanely likable. She's sweet to everyone she meets, but she also has a curiosity about the world around her, although it's less so than Mei's, but it's just as sincere. But there's another level to her character also. Satsuki and Mei's mother is in the hospital for an unspecified reason, and because of this, Satsuki has a great deal of fear and pain within her. Mei's too young to fully grasp the situation, but Satsuki's old enough to, and because of this, she feels she must help her father look after Mei and carry all that fear inside about her mother. And in a typical movie, Satsuki would be, too distant and cold towards everyone she meets. But in this film, she isn't. She's actually quite the opposite. She's one of the kindest characters in any animated film that is past the baby stage that animators put a lot of their characters in. And maybe I'm just a jerk, but I usually don't sympathize with a character who is always rude to people, no matter the reason. I mean, sure, they can be in a situation that's sympathetic, but Debbie Downers just get tired in the film after a while. There has to be a little bit more to them. And because Satsuki's, in a difficult situation, and yet manages to handle it so well, I care more for her and other characters involved than I would, in a much more drastic scenario in some other films. And there's a scene towards the end of the film where Satsuki discovers that her mother has a cold and can't come home when she was scheduled to. She reveals her fears to a neighbor, and apparently, something like this happened a while back, which was scheduled to return, but it turned out to be worse than a cold that they think it is now, and her mother got even more sick. And Satsuki expresses her fear that her mother may be dying, and she begins to break down into tears. And because Satsuki has been such a cheerful, character throughout the film, this scene of desperation, of her breaking down and losing all hope, is much more powerful than it would have been in a typical film. And it really reached me on an emotional level. And it's also one of the things that makes this film so great. And while worrying about the same thing earlier in the film, Satsuki yells at her sister Mei out of frustration. And again, in most films this would appear formulaic, but since both girls have been so real up to that point, I bought it completely. And it seemed like much more than just a plot device. And Mei's reaction is also very real. If you're watching this review before seeing this film, you won't fully understand this, but if you've seen this film, then I think you'll agree with me that the entire scene is very realistic, and it's a great portrayal of what would happen in that situation. And both Mei's and Satsuki's breakdowns are very realistic as well. And by combining the realistic children with a bad situation and mixing in some wonderful fantasy creatures, I believe that Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli have created a masterpiece that has got to be one of the most heartbreaking and heartwarming films I have ever seen. A word that I haven't mentioned enough yet in this review is the word love. Love can be very powerful in film, in both good ways and in bad ways. There's plenty of love in this film to go around, but I felt it the most in scenes involving Satsuki and Mei. I felt some kind of special connection between these two characters that is most certainly love. And I feel weird saying that since these are animated characters we're talking about, and not real people acting. But the love and emotion was truly there, and my heart was warmed every single time these two were on screen together, which is a majority of the movie. I think the love between all the characters in this film has a lot to say about the love that Miyazaki and the rest of Studio Ghibli had for this movie. Film is a form of artistic expression after all, and I firmly believe that the love between the characters in this film is a reflection of Studio Ghibli's love for the entire movie. And this feeling of love isn't exclusive to My Neighbor Totoro. In fact, it exists in nearly every Studio Ghibli film I've seen. But the fact that all this love is being expressed in a film about the greatness of childhood innocence and imagination, plus since a majority of the love is coming from two little kids, which I believe is the most genuine form of love in existence, gives this love in the film a heightened effectiveness. And it also makes this one of the sweetest movies I've ever seen. Now, before I wrap things up, I wanted to discuss two more things that help make this film great. The first are all the other characters in the film. They're all great, but the two best are the girl's father and their elderly neighbor that they call Granny. And I keep saying in a typical film, blah blah blah, but I'm going to say it again. In an ordinary film with this subject matter, these two characters, or at least one of them, would be completely anti-imagination and would tell the children, that Totoro is poppycock or what have you, and that it is time for Satsuki to grow up. And I know I just described Peter Pan, but I'm being serious. There isn't a single character in this film who flat out dismissed the girl's claims of seeing Totoro or other things, such as, the soot sprites in their house. If anything, they play along and tell the girls that what they saw was real. I can't think of another film based in, the real world about children going on fantastical adventures where pretty much every adult character encourages the children's fantasies. Or heck, the way they encourage them, they may believe themselves. I really don't know. The last thing I want to do in this review is talk about a certain scene in the film. It's a scene that I always think about when I think about this film, because it's a scene that showed me that this was a different kind of animated feature. About halfway through the film, Satsuki and Mei are waiting for their dad's bus to arrive at a bus stop on a rainy night. Their father isn't on the bus they expected him to be on. It grows later, and a comment is made about how their father is late. Rain begins to pour. I braced myself. I knew it was coming. I knew that something terrible had happened to the father, and since I had become so attached to the characters, I was going to be heartbroken. The tension peaked, and what happened? Totoro walks up, and Satsuki sees him for the first time. And in a delightful scene, she gives him an umbrella to show him and shows him how to use it. Then a type of cat bus runs up, and Totoro gets on and leaves. Shortly after, their father arrives on a late bus. Their father dying in some bus accident, like I expected would happen, wouldn't have necessarily hurt the film, but it would have made it a lot different. I was so used to the typical animated films that I knew that a moment of tension nearly always resulted in a big event. But it didn't happen in this film. Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli had a vision to make a film different from others, and they succeeded greatly. And this really is a very special film. Now, some of you may know that there's a sort of urban legend claiming that this film is a representation of a murder that took place in Japan in the 1960s. And you may want to hear my opinion on it. Well, I think it's an interesting theory, but I doubt that it's a real thing. But I sort of want to talk about it, but I don't think a traditional review like this is the place to do it. Plus, I'd like to mention this movie more in my channel when I make future reviews. So, I think I'm going to make a video later dedicated to this subject. And, when I really start analyzing the film and thinking about, taking what the urban legend says and, making it fall in line with the film, it's sort of, I don't want to say it, well, I said I don't want to talk about it right now, so I won't really, but I think it'll be an interesting video that I make in the future about it. Now, I'm not going to give My Neighbor Totoro a numerical rating, and I also won't rate other animated films. There's a reason for this that I'll explain later, but of course I recommend it. It's a great film that any fan of great movies will enjoy. And of course, one may not like it as much if they don't like other animated films, but if you can at least stand them, then this is a film you can't pass up. I really can't express just how special this film is, and I feel that way about very few animated films, and very few films in general. This movie warmed my heart like very few ever have. I hope you enjoyed the review and expect more soon.